All right, hi everyone. We're here to talk about why everyone should have a job in the service industry. So I feel like all of us in this group have had jobs previously where we've worked in the service industry, and you have a lot of people who don't necessarily treat everyone well and stuff like that. And there are also a lot of skills that you can gain. And so we wanted to talk about some of the things that we've personally learned that we think we can carry into our future careers, because that's something that not everyone will have and benefit from in their jobs after college. And then something else we want to talk about are some of our experiences that we've had, give some examples of real life situations where you can clearly see people who don't understand what it's like to have a job in the service industry and how it probably would have benefited them if they had. So I think to begin, we're going to talk to Nicole, who wanted to say a little bit about some of the skills that she's learned in the service industry.
Well, first, I think it's important for people to work in the industry because you learn and gain so much and so many skills. You learn how to be polite and listen to people. It helps you to appreciate what people do in their job. Some personal experience. My first job I've ever had it was as a waitress. I learned to be attentiveness to what customers wanted, learn how to multitask. I learned that the customer is always right. I had to think fast to solve any problems with the customers, and I really learned how to better tip them. Because you would think that they don't really deserve to be tipped, but they do because we really do a lot of things. My second job was in a check cashing place. That job, I think it was a little bit harder because you dealing with money, people stress out a lot, so you had to be more patient. Um, you have to be careful. Listen, you have to really listen what they want. If not, they get really, really upset. You learn not to talk back, just to suck it up and make them think that they're right, even though um, you learn to you have to learn how to answer correctly to the customer. I think that's it.
I think those are all awesome points, Nicole. I'm
Yeah.
actually going to piggyback off of that whole discussion that Nicole just kind of started out on. I have been in the service industry for 4 years, a different end of the service industry. I am an esthetician. I have my aesthetics license. I am a waxer, and I've been waxing for 4 years. I feel like being a waxer has given me a hugely different outlook on how to treat people in the service industry. No, I've never waited tables, but I also understand that having to talk to people and have discussions with them on a regular basis is it can be tiring for them, but it's a big deal for them to actually listen to you and pay attention to you. And I think all along with that, I've learned how big of a deal tipping well is when you receive a good service. I always tried to tip well. It was something that was always very important to me, something my parents instilled into me as important. But I think once I actually began waxing and started working off of tips, you realize how important tips are to people that work in the service industry, whether you're waxing or you're waiting tables, or it doesn't matter what you're doing. If they receive tips, they're probably making the majority of their money off of the tips. And I think that the tipping policy in America has almost changed as the years have gone on. I feel as if the average 10% tip is kind of what the tipping standard used to be, is no longer the tipping standard. I feel as if now, as the cost of living rises, that it should be at least 15% minimum, is what I always tip, at least. Um, And if it's a good service, I'll tip 25, 30%. I usually start at 30%, and if something happens in the service or like they're incredibly rude to me, I move my mark down from there. But I think just because that is so important to me and it's something that I've learned in my experience. I also feel that it's really important to work in the service industry because then you realize that being in a position where you're serving someone else doesn't automatically put them below you. Just because I'm in the service industry doesn't mean I'm not doing something with my life. It doesn't mean I'm not going to school or trying to accomplish something bigger in my life later on. I think it's really common for people to go sit down at a table in a restaurant or go receive a service somewhere and treat the person helping them like they are inferior to them because they are helping them. But I think that's a huge mistake because you don't know what's going on in their lives. For all you know, they have 4 degrees and they're just working there because they want something to do for fun. You never know. You can never assume. I think it's really important not to ever assume. And really, I think those are some of the biggest reasons that you should work in the industry.
Okay, my turn, right? Sorry, I can't tell if you guys can hear me. Good. So I believe it's important for people to work in the service industry for a few reasons. First, as everyone's kind of said, it teaches you valuable lessons like work ethic, as well as it introduces you to a wide array of people. The higher you have of a position in a certain, like if you work in a school or education or as an executive, more than likely you're working with people who have similar backgrounds to you. They went to similar education, things like that. When you work in the service industry, you can work with anyone. They can come from any country, they can have any culture, and it's very interesting, and it kind of opens your eyes. As well as when you work for a job that's really tough, you really know how to respect the dollar and have respect for others. A lot of times when people don't work in that industry, they have a tendency, as everyone said, to undervalue the work that's done. I believe we see this with executives. They're the ones who set the wages, and often they set them really low based on this idea that what the people are doing isn't that important. Well, I think we can all say, I mean, without people in the service industry, there would be nothing to do. You couldn't go get food, you couldn't go to the movies, you couldn't. The service industry is such a crucial part of our economy. To devalue them, it seems illogical almost. There's an example. McDonald's is one everyone's talking about now because of the protests. But I know about, I think 2 years back, they released a website, and it was how to budget on minimum wage and still have enough money. And people went over the budgeting and the tools, and what they discovered is everything that the website was saying, like what things should cost, food, rent, utilities, were way below what they actually cost today. So the only way McDonald's could possibly stretch that their minimum wage was enough to live on was to lie about what it costs to live on. And I think that kind of becomes common the more of dissidence there is between middle and upper class. I really believe that the way that the United States is the strongest is when there's a strong middle class. And oftentimes, if you're in the middle class, you might not be in the service industry, but someone you know or one of your relatives or your children might be. And we've kind of gotten to a place where if a child has to work, in college, it's kind of like the parent didn't work hard enough to provide for the child, which is ridiculous because children need to work. I mean, obviously not kids. I'm talking about young adults, teenagers to 20-year-olds. It's important in that age range to work those positions because it really does teach you about, well, basically everything, the value of a dollar, work ethic, and how to treat people with proper respect.
All right, so I think a lot of the points that you made are really good, and I wanted to add something a little bit that kind of reminded me of, actually. When you said that everyone kind of learns, kind of instills those skills from that first job and all that stuff, that made me think about the first time I started working in high school. And it wasn't anything major. I mean, I worked at Einstein's Bagels on the weekend, and it wasn't it wasn't. It was just kind of to have a job. Really, it was something to gain experience. And I think what I realized though is nothing made me mature faster than having a job. It was one of those things where I went through school and teachers tell you like you got to be prepared for the real world. You got to be prepared for the real world, and that's okay. But once you actually enter the real world and you have a job and you see how hard people work, which is also going back to your point too. You mentioned that when you have those entry-level jobs, you get to see all sorts of different kinds of people. That's when I got to see all these different types of people, and the people who were really young and had kids, or the people who were in college and, or the people who were 40 and coming back to college. All sorts of people, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that the world's not black and white. And that's something that I never experienced in school, and so that kind of really opened my eyes. And then the other thing that I really want to talk about is Alicia mentioned something about how you can never assume with people. I think that's very true, and I wanted to share kind of a personal story with that. I work at Starbucks currently, and respect is something that's become very important to me because I actually had someone tell me once in a discussion of politics, well, your view doesn't matter because you work at Starbucks, word for word. And that was something that was a little bit shocking to me. I actually didn't bother giving my opinion because at that point that person had no interest in me and I just left. But it's something that I think people who don't understand, who haven't entered the service industry, are missing a lot of things. So they're not only undervaluing your work, but they're undervaluing the fact that these are voters, for instance. I mean, you don't need to disregard them if they're someone who, from a political standpoint, maybe you should talk to because they're a real person. And then I think, too, just the fact that anyone could be so disrespectful to a person is kind of indicative of the fact that they've never been spoken to that way. And you need to really work in that position because you have a lot of people who will come in and no one, while I've actually been at work, has said, your opinion doesn't matter, you work at Starbucks, but you can tell that that's kind of what they're thinking based on their behavior. And so I think realizing that everyone has to start somewhere is really important because then you realize that I'm a college student and eventually I could have a real position. I could even potentially be their boss one day. So it's really something that I think people need to experience in order to consider fully. All right.
Awesome.
So now we're going to do some cross conversations, right?
Yeah.
Talking back and forth.
I have a question. What's the worst experience you guys have had in the service industry where it's clear somebody just really disrespected your position or disrespected you based on something you thought was unfounded?
Now you're making us think. Oh boy.
This is school assignment.
I have to say, I've had a lot of instances where I have had people devalue me just because I am ripping their body hair out. Clearly, I don't know anything. I went to school. Excuse me, that was a dust storm alert. I went to school to get my aesthetics license, and so clearly I'm not doing anything in life. Did I even graduate from high school? Nobody knows. I've worked in different areas of Scottsdale and near Arcadia, and so I feel like there's a lot of money in the area, and you get a lot of really snobby people. I was having a discussion once with a client, and she was telling me all about her life, and then she was like, oh yeah, but because you wax. And I was like, what do you mean because I wax? Because she was talking about, how successful she was, and she's like, well, what does your husband do? And I was like, well, he works at Starbucks, and she goes, oh. And she just kind of stared at me in disdain, and then I started talking about something, and she interrupted me, and she goes, well, my children, and she continues to tell me about how she has a child who's a CEO, and she has another one who does something else, and every point after that, I couldn't even discuss anything because I wasn't doing anything with my life. She finally asked me if I was going to school still. I told her I was getting my degree in communications, and she presumed to tell me how everyone gets their degree in communications. So I feel as if, even though that isn't like this big horrible story, no one told me, wow, you're just a waxer. It was kind of the inferred, you know, well, you're just waxing. Yeah. And I feel as if that's something I actually get often. It's something I encounter almost daily, in fact.
Yeah, I thought I would share too. I don't know if this is. I couldn't think of a story that was like one big bad occasion, but one thing that I did think of is how frequently when people come through the drive-through, especially, people try to kind of rip off your drinks. Everyone wants to say like, oh, well, last time they gave this to me with whole milk, and I asked for soy, and it almost killed me. And so, what are you going to do about it? Because they want the drink for free, or some variation of that. Or the one that pisses me off is if you say, I want a venti iced tea, no ice, and then a cup of ice on the side, so that they can like get two drinks. And it's not even necessarily something where they're like stating to me openly, like I devalue you. And in some ways, I mean, they're trying to rip off the company, not me personally. But it's still one of those things where when people act like that, I feel like they have such disrespect for my job because it's something where they're, I don't know, I take that personally as something where like your position is disrespected and we're going to try and circumvent you and we're just really not appreciating what you're doing. Let's see, but yeah.
What about you guys?
I can't think of one right now.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. So oddly enough, mine customer, but it's actually from a fellow employee. I worked at Five Guys on Mill for just a few months, and there was one guy who worked there who was going to ASU like most of the rest of us, but he obviously came from a slightly richer family. And at one point, we were having a conversation, and somebody mentioned their friend coming in to see them that day, and he actually was like, "You tell your friends you work here? Aren't you embarrassed to admit that?" And he like really went on for a while about how like it was demeaning to work in that position, and even though we're in college working towards another goal, he would never tell his friends that he worked there or like for them to come visit because he thinks they would look down on him. And it was very unnerving for me because like this is somebody I worked with, and they're just like devaluing what they do, what I do, what the entire everything. And it just seemed very rude, in my opinion, just to say, like, you should be embarrassed to work here. I still kind of think about that and get a little angry.
That's horrible. I've never had something like that happen to me. I can't even imagine. Just another reason I think it shows that if you work in the industry, I think it teaches you how to respect others better. What about the minimum wage thing and raising it for entry-level positions like that? What do you guys think on that topic?
I think it depends on what kind of job you get. It should depend on what kind of job you get and how much they should pay, because they say about McDonald's getting paid $15, but they will not get paid starting off. It's going to be throughout the years. But I don't think it's also reasonable for somebody to be flipping burgers for so many years. I think that people who have more education should have a better pay because they do spend money in school. They put more effort, and they what's that word? They should get paid for what they know and not what they do.
Um, yeah, I definitely agree to an extent that you need to make sure that people are being paid according to their value, and people who know more should be paid more than people who don't. I think what's interesting about what Alora is saying, though, is it is, and you can't necessarily function off of the current minimum wage that some people are giving. Um, the one struggle I know from an economics class I've taken is that if you're not careful and you raise the minimum wage artificially high, what happens is no one can pay for minimum wage employees, and so you actually end up hurting them because no McDonald's can't hire anyone. Their business, they're actually in rapid recession for their business, and so adding $15 an hour to all of their employees is going to hurt them majorly. But that being said, there's a difference between raising the minimum wage to what it should be and artificially inflating it. So if inflation has gone up to the point that that most people can't afford to live on minimum wage, and I think it's probably a good indication that now is a good time for it to increase.
So, I mean, that's a very good point, and he's right. Problem with raising the minimum wage is, I mean, like the money has to come from somewhere, and if you're taking it out, like, if you're giving someone more money, obviously, and usually it does just end up inflating. Kind of what I try to say in mine, I didn't do the best job, is what I think we're seeing, though, more and more is people kind of overvaluing what executives do. I understand what they do is important. I understand they have a lot of risk, and they make the big decisions. But I think a lot of times executives are more concerned if they're going to be able to afford their second vacation home than if a majority of their employees are able to afford health care. This is certainly not all, but we all know of businesses that take care of their employees. So I know it's possible. I just think if a company is saying this position needs to exist, they should find a way to make the wages livable, which is, I know, what we're all saying. That's kind of what I think we've all been talking about valuing the position. I just think we're undervaluing service positions and overvaluing kind of executive and managerial, given not all managers make a lot of money.
So I completely agree with that. I think there is something to be said for executives making all the money and maybe undervaluing their employees. I do think that it kind of goes along, though, with that. I worked to get here, I have the education, I should get paid more for that position, because they did. They probably worked their butts off for that position. But I do think that companies undervalue their lower-end employees. I think if you're going to pay your employees less, you need to do things like Starbucks does with the stellar health care and 401k matching and stock options. Like, those are all great things that help kind of subsidize that low, you don't make as much money. I also think that, you can do things like Netflix did the unlimited maternity leave the first year. That's awesome. That makes your employees happier, and it kind of helps, if you're not making as much, it helps, even it out a little bit. Did you have something to say?
Well, I was going to add something very similar to the Starbucks point. One, I think I think what matters is that it's doable, because Starbucks pays its employees more than minimum wage, and it provides you get stock options, and you get Premera healthcare. But we're talking about sacrificing the executive wage to kind of help everyone else a little bit, or we're overvaluing the executive. But Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, makes about $2,000 an hour plus. So what I think is interesting, though, about it is that he can still, and provides his employees with college. And so what I think the important lesson to learn from that is a CEO can still make plenty of money and still provide for his employees, because I think he does an excellent job of doing that. And kind of to go back to our overall point, he started out as someone who was impoverished, worked service jobs, and worked his way into Harvard Business School and founded the business himself, and actually worked behind the counter at Starbucks originally. So I think that all kind of goes to show that if you start out with a service job, it ends up working out well for you.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, you guys. So I think that's it. Is there anything you'd like to unmute your microphone to say?
No.
I think we did good.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll
Awesome.
stop the broadcast
Guys.
now.